Yeah. And then calls like your rain. So, well, I'm gonna.
Sorry. What would you about somewhere like easier for you? Somewhere you're ready.
Sit there and stand up over and over again. It's very. But I'll just tell people to stand. Do you give them my Did they give you one? I had an internal idea. Oh yeah. You might not have seen this room just now, the mask one connect. Thank you. All right. Go ahead. So I'm pleased to welcome you to the third and final keynote of the Experience in Nature conference. The speaker. Final speaker, we're going to talk about animals and emotions and startle response. Okay, so our speaker is Stephen Fesmire, who is professor of philosophy at Radford University. He is the author of another book and as well as a nice book on Dewey and the editor of the Oxford Companion to Dewey, and the author of the recent wonderful book Beyond Moral Fundamentalism Towards Pragmatic Pluralism. And he's a scholar and a distinguished alumnus of this program at SIU. And we're happy to have him. Thanks. You've got the box down here. I had a few dollars left from an internal award, and I thought I bought a few copies of this book. There's a box full of them right there, and I don't have any way of selecting a number of you. I may have our especially a graduate student or a young scholar. They're right there, and they're free. So by all means, at some point, if you're before you take off, feel free to grab a copy. It's on ethics, politics, and education, which I talked about a bit today. This is real. It's in Kyoto, in northwest Kyoto. It's a Zen temple. Ryuanji, very famous, probably the most famous rock garden, 1,000 years old. One of the cool things about it is that there are 15 stones placed very carefully. And from no vantage point can you see all 15. You can see 14. And so you can walk across a little platform above the garden and you can spot 14 at most any vantage point, but never 15. Right? It's a Zen garden, so it's a Zen koan, and you're supposed to be meditating, cultivating your mind with the fact that one of them always escapes. In James's words, something always escapes. This might be an inspiring model. I don't have a PowerPoint other than one slide, other than this, but maybe this will be calming and meditative as I speak. And I'll be reading for the most part this piece. I'm actually revising it. We're working on the second edition, which is doing like a Routledge volume, cleverly titled Dewey. And that one I'm trying to figure out the denotative method that we've all been talking about in a way that not only can I explain it technically, but can explain it in kind of more introductory language. This is the technical version of it, but I'm going to try to translate that. So I am trying to kind of figure out the prose here. So mostly. First, this is just a prelude, and this is a tribute to Experience in Nature at 100 before I get down to business. It's a common presumption that one's own understanding has been impartially adjusted by the universal plumb line of reason, direct intuition, or divine authority. Descartes ran with a related image in the Discourse on Method. It's a metaphor for adjusting his opinions au niveau de la raison. In both scholarly discourse and popular culture, Descartes' 17th century assumption that we can square our individual judgments to the fixed geometry of God's creation persists today as a latent recurring habit, even among those who reject such beliefs with derision. Whatever their metaphysical stances, philosophers inspired by Dewey's experience in nature have for a century argued that no plumb line of pure thought or transcendental reason is required as a leveling reference to orient inquiries, nor has an extra relational universal level ever been available. The dream of an impartial state or act purified of natural interactions is itself a delusional partiality, all the more obnoxious for its evasive self-concealment. Dewey set out to redirect the misguided search for fixed leveling references in logic and in religious, artistic, aesthetic, economic, political life, just as Darwin and fellow evolutionary thinkers had done for formal causes that forever define the essences of objects, of species. He argued that the quest for fixity has always been ill suited to the revolving and evolving world we actually inhabit. Instability has made itself at home with the natural sciences, Dewey observed, but in, quote, religion, morals, economics, politics, it's widely presumed that we must choose between anarchy and stasis. We still pretend that our religion is the final one, our savior, prophet, the final embodiment of divinity. The general principles of our economic regime, the culmination of economic evolution, our concept of family and marriage, the irrevocable word. Yet we are parts of a world that is, in Dewey's words, a moving whole of interacting parts. As such, natural human existence doesn't afford a single universal and necessary frame of reference to be accessed by a spectatorial mind or soul. Our values, along with whatever measure of transient security we attain, are born, quote, of qualitative individuality and constant relations, contingency and need, movement and rest, end quote. Looking at this note, I have annotations all over this text. If you see me like looking down, I'm trying to figure out what it was that I wrote, what you guys were talking about in all these papers. Here, I've got John remarks on qualitative entangling. That will be in the book. Dewey
Dewey's naturalistic and empirical approach won't, of course, satisfy what James called the rationalistic temperament. Many conceive some unlovable about a world in which all purposiveness is evolving and thus finally vulnerable to chance. It seems to them to denigrate rather than celebrate human life. Yet a naturalistic philosophy can be humble and inspiring. It can also be richly explanatory of human capacities, cultural achievements, and social possibilities. We may strut and fret our hour upon the stage, as Macbeth despaired, but our lives as valuing animals are more meaningful, purposeful, and value-rich than mere tales told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. As Mark Johnson and Jay Shulkin urge in their recent book on experience in nature, where they use that line, we don't need to call down non-evolving, supernatural, or transcendent entities, agencies, forces, causes, or values to see that things and ends beyond us matter, and, quote, to find meaningful ways to carry on and to throw in with the better rather than the worse, end quote. All right, that was good. Now, this section is the moving, unbalanced balance of things, ecological imagination, and problematic situations. Dewey himself lived as he counseled in the closing chapter of Experience in Nature, using thought to its utmost and throwing his puny strength into the moving, unbalanced balance of things. In this book-long description of the world's unbalanced balance, he exhibited skill in a form of imaginative inquiry often identified today as ecological. Dewey argued, at least as early as his 1896 critique of the reflex art, that we achieve integration and coordination through the feedback loops of our relationships, not through exertions emanating from the inner space of mind. Over 50 years later, he wrote that the ontological lesson forecast by the descriptive state work of the ecologies is that we'll increasingly recognize experience as transdermally transactional. Mouthful. We're belatedly growing aware of the hazards of using pre-ecological, non-relational, individualistic conceptual maps for navigating life. Riffing on an observation by Herbert Spencer, Dewey asserted, quote, the visible is set in the invisible, and in the end, what is unseen decides what happens in the seen. The tangible rests precariously upon the untouched and ungrasped. The contrast is the potential maladjustment of the immediate, the conspicuous and vocal phase of things, with those indirect and hidden factors which determine the origin and career of what is present, are indestructible features of any and every experience. Philosophers steeped in Dewey's idiom are well advised not to rely upon his terms to do the work he intended for them. Subject matter of half of our sessions, perhaps. In Tom Alexander's mantra, by experience, Dewey doesn't mean experience. By nature, Dewey doesn't mean nature. By mind, Dewey doesn't mean mind. And so, as Roberta Trion observed yesterday, he used the words experience and also the word situation in what James called a double-barreled sense, referring simultaneously to what is indicated by such terms as organism and environment, the sower and the sown. That's what experiences of breathing, walking, and digesting. A situation is the total transactive scene of any specific action or event. Experience is fuller than our perceptual umwelt, our phenomenal sensory bubble. It's the unanalyzed totality of humanity's way of dwelling in the world. Dewey used the words nature and existence synonymously to emphasize the immensity of the natural world in which we dwell, whereas he used experience to emphasize our embodied cultural inhabitation of that world. Faced with the historical problem that in English experience connoted private Lockean sensations and ideas behind the eyes and between the ears, the opposite of what Dewey meant, he wrote in a new introduction to Experience in Nature, left unfinished at its death, spotlighted for this audience by Randy Osher on our first day, complicated by archival sleuthing with Matt and Andre. And I don't even know if I can read chicken scratch here because I was like having to rewrite this because of your presentation. No, let's see if I can actually get Dewey's words and not someone who didn't pay adequate attention. Were the book, Dewey quote, were the book that was called Experience and Nature being written today, the title would be Culture and Nature. He held that the word culture carried a meaning of living and inhabiting that better designated, in the words of experience and nature, both what is experienced and the ways of experiencing it. Maybe. Best not to get fixated on single words. Promisingly, Gregory Pappas suggests the Spanish la vida, which I think can have a sort of anthropic tone to it. Anyhow, take culture as a hypothesis and check to see if it carries the load in what follows, because most of what I'm going to say is going to be about politics and ethics and value areas, and sometimes the word culture just doesn't seem to quite capture the way that we have to respect others as centers of experience. And culture seems to maybe not be adequate for that. We need lots of terms, lots of words, getting fixated on one, probably not. Regardless, the terminology of experience in nature, as Alexander observes, experience is what human beings make out of existence. It is how we exist in nature. Experience is thus an evolutionary latecomer to existence, though it is a remarkably capable latecomer, as illustrated by scientific, artistic, aesthetic, and moral experiences. Like any other animal, our sensory biology guides and structures the way we exist in nature. But Dewey nevertheless insisted against Lockean holdovers that there is no impenetrable phenomenal veil that forever shuts us off from, quote, a growing progressive self-disclosure of nature itself. If Dewey could be said to have a theory of substance, race, even remotely analogous to traditional metaphysics, and it was contained in this idea of a holistic situation, this basic. Every situation, every experience we have is situated, from its brilliant selective focus, conspicuous and apparent, to its horizontal field, the obscured, enveloping, and felt context. The situation, as such, is not itself a perceived object that we might know, or is it a selected group of objects. It's the total shifting field in which such objects are set, found, and made, including the field's temporal spread, its past and possibilities. To be clarified in 38 logic, quote, an object or event, Scott Taylor did a nice job. An object or event is always a special part, phrase, or aspect of an environing experienced world, a situation. There's always a field in which observation of this or that object or event occurs. Isolation of what is perceived from the course of life behavior would be not only futile, but obstructive, in many cases, fatally so. Practical life demands that we ignore, in Dewey's words, a vast number of the things that nature presents to us. But if we forget our selectivity and get taken in by our abstractions, reflection fails to note the contours of the constitutive situation. If our reflection method fails to bring us back to that situation, we pay a heavy price. Like more recent ecological philosophies, Dewey urges humility about haphazard attempts to manage tiny portions of our environments without experimental understanding of the often tragic consequences of isolating focal objects, acts, and ideas from their situational fields. This humility informs his methodological approach in experience and nature. Now, the next section is on that approach, the denotative method. What I was just reading, the previous section, is actually the basis of a book I'm working on called Ecological Imagination. So I haven't developed it in a lot more depth and detail. In this expansive 1925 first chapter of Experience in Nature, which, like John and others have mentioned, is just simply much richer, more, lots of arts examples there. And 1929 introduction that was written at the same time that the quest for certainty was being developed. Understandably, it was more, M&E science mind kind of focus in that, but it does lead to a narrow in the 1929 revision. Dewey proposed a contextually sensitive denotative method as the means for philosophy to avoid hyper-intellectualism in its attempts to disclose existential experiential truths. The term is clunky, but it denotes Dewey's way of doing philosophy since at least his 1905 the postulate of immediate empiricism. I'll spend the rest of my time today on this method of receptivity in order to clarify the centrality for Dewey of this instrument that he forged to help intellectuals deal with humane problems. The method, way, approach, begins, and you know the pattern, with a situation experienced firsthand, mostly subconsciously, that sets questions and supplies subject matter to grapple with. This is direct, immediate, or primary experience in Dewey's terms. Some need, doubt, or ambiguity in that situation elicits a search for symbolic formulations, technologies, or other arts to refine perception and refocus attention. This is secondary experience. Notice that I was saying arts. It's often explained in some way that it's like an epistemology for returning that. We then look back from secondary experience to the tensive situation at hand with these refinements, with whatever perceptual or intellectual aid, whatever explaining or expressive power they afford. This return qualifies and expands the significance of the original course phenomena. It marks them with, quote, a far-reaching significance they did not previously have, makes our dealings with them more fruitful, and opens new lines of investigation. Now, Dewey was no essentialist, so he didn't mean to lock in certain experiences as essentially primary or secondary, any more than he essentialized ends and means. He emphasized that experience is primarily had or undergone. It is suffered or enjoyed. But he was up against a monopolizing view of cognitive experience that had lost all context. That intellectualist view renders inexplicable the whole adaptive and adjustive point of a biological organism reflecting. So he reversed their ordinal positions and identified intellectual experience as secondary and derivative. But this invites confusion, given that what counts as primary or secondary, though not arbitrary, is something of a moving target. Take our intellectual lives at this moment. They don't fit neatly and exclusively in the basket of secondary experience. My theoretical hypotheses today about Dewey's denotative method originate in interpretive needs. We'll check these hypotheses against the datum of Dewey's works, noting where they jive or jar, and we'll refine and qualify our various starting conceptions accordingly. This example suggested some unstiffening of the primary-secondary distinction is in order, as long as we don't get lost in the weeds. The tendency for intellectuals to get lost in the weeds and to forget what we're about is precisely Dewey's concern. Getting lost in abstractions occludes ordinary predicaments and leads to what he called a breach of continuity between cognitive adaptations on one hand and non-cognitive needs on the other. By the denotative method, Dewey had in mind something more basic than scientific knowing, and he certainly didn't intend denotation as a criterion demarcating science from other activities. Science illustrates the denotative method, but so does art. Dewey argued that philosophy does not yet illustrate it, and arguably his main point in experience in nature was that it could do so if it would pay more attention to science and art at their best. Science exemplifies the method when it is experimental, using hypotheses, quote, as directive ideas for making new observations and experiments among the things of raw experience, end quote. Dewey pointed to Einstein's theoretical calculations in general relativity, tested by Eddington's 1919 photos of the deflection of starlight by the sun. Dewey repeatedly insisted that such thick experimental empiricism in the sciences, hypothesizing and checking, contrast with traditional British empiricist philosophy's then method, which drove a wedge between subjective ideas and natural reality, and thereby concealed and discounted primary experiences that are back of any science. Minding the same vein in the quest for certainty, Dewey explicitly identified himself with the pragmatism of Peirce and James by defining ideas and theories instrumentally in terms of operations to be performed. Again, think Eddington's Ecological. And by defining the validity of these ideas, quote, by the consequences of these operations. Rather than reducing experience to a distinctive subject matter, such as consciousness or mental states, denotation approaches experience as a method, not as an ontological category, as a method, as a point, or a way of pointing, attending, marking out, showing. Dewey conceived the denotative method as an art of progressively disclosing activities and events in their situated fullness, directed by this receptive approach, following the experiential path. We remember that situations contain more than is found in our ideas about them, no matter how reverential those ideas may be toward the quotidian. Dewey thus presents the denotative method as, quote, a test of the value of any philosophy which is offered us. Does it end in conclusions which, when they are referred back to ordinary life experiences and their predicaments, render them more significant, more luminous to us, and make our dealings with them more fruitful? Dewey asserted that contemporaneous empiricists like Russell failed this test by leading philosophers down blind alleys with two-dimensional black and white dialectical notions. Dewey quoted Russell in the 1925 introductory chapter. Quote, here's Russell. When I look at a chair, I say I experienced it. But what I actually experience is only a very few of the elements that go to make up a chair, namely that color that belongs to the chair under those particular conditions of light, the shape which the chair displays when viewed from this angle, etc. Such theorizing about so-called experience, Dewey quips, has convinced, quote, many a philosophy student that he gets nearer to the reality of experience the further away he gets from all the experience he has ever had. To the joke in experience energy. For Russell, Dewey argues, to see the chair is to experience less than the chair. But actual human experience isn't just built up from sense data. We experience more of the chair by sitting than by looking at it. But even limiting ourselves to visual cues, a less sophisticated person than Russell will experience a good deal more than the chair. She will lay hold, Dewey suggests, quote, of a wide spatial context, such as the room where the chair is and the spread of its history, end quote. That's my grandfather's pulpit chair. He was a Methodist minister. Probably got it around 1930s, 1940s. It's an antique model based on a colonial design from the previous century, but it's actually just a knockoff. And I know that because if you go underneath it, there's a little half of a label. And it didn't have the full information, but I just Googled in that half of the label, and I came up with Elgin A. Simon's company. And so it would have been made, in fact, specifically, I found the catalog online. It's from, it was made in the 1920s. By 1927, it was in the catalog, that very chair. So anyway, it became my grandfather's chair, a pulpit given by a congregation or something. And then I grew up with this chair. So when I would visit, I can't remember what room it was in. It was like in the living room. You weren't supposed to sit in it because my grandmother would not. There was not a chair for sitting in. You could sit somewhere else. This is a very special. And then when they passed, I think it went to my parents. So, and it stayed in their place for like 30 years. They passed last year. So no, it's made of walnut. Trimmed to hide it. It's a Windsor armchair, as far as the style. Lots of information about it. My mom painted that. There. Lots of information. Huh? Safe to say that I experience this chair differently than you. But I can use language, images, and signs, not to mention the secondary experience of Googling, to exhibit, denote something of my experiential reference frame. This in turn refines, qualifies, and expands your original experience so that you encounter the subject matter as far more than just sensory impressions. And we could continue that positive feedback loop indefinitely. And occasionally, I like, read the Russell line again. There's something fundamentally missing there, and he was just way too stuck in his head. And Dewey was trying to help to sort of unstick it. The Denotative method illuminates Dewey's philosophic turn toward bringing our thinking back to life. That is, back to primary experiences, which should be consummated or readjusted, but too often aren't. Such experience, he urged, is, in his words, the philosopher's real datum. That's in the original rich introduction. Even as the method brings thinking back to life, it brings life back to thinking. As a method that is open and receptive to the spatial and temporal context of life, Dewey conceived it as our best check against the etiolation, the bleaching, of narrowly reductive philosophies, to appropriate an image from J.L. Austin. Etiolated philosophies are pale and feeble because of an intellectualism that blocks them from the chlorophyll-producing sunlight of lived experience. In the 1949 reintroduction to Experience in Nature, Dewey insisted that the Denotative method aims at what he called an intellectual piety toward experience that compensates for our will to impose conceptual and practical schemes, often illusory ones. We must be more careful when we make isms out of experience. Let me illustrate and practice Dewey's method now by very briefly pointing to three central interrelated areas of his mature philosophy that express this non-dominating piety toward experience: his democratic political philosophy, his ethical theory, and the ends means continuum. All elements of it, I use this as kind of a magic thread in Dewey's book. So we can point to any aspect of his philosophy, and I think it would work quite well. The aesthetics is no challenge because you can just hand it to somebody and you look at the title, art is experience. But with regard to the political philosophy and the ethics, I think it requires a little elaboration. So I don't think so. So first, democratic political philosophy. Many recent political philosophers have rejected the quest for a self-sufficient ideal theory. As Rawls called his idealized original position approach to a well-ordered society in which free, equal, and autonomous rational contractors fully comply with the requirements of justice. Critics proposed shifting to a non-ideal point of departure. They don't, of course, object to idealizations, but most insist that values have to be appraised in light of the particular contexts and purposes that generate them. Michelle Moody Adams observes that non-ideal theorists may be making too big a deal out of it, but she agrees with fellow Rawls student Elizabeth Anderson that ideal theories are just unnecessary. You just plunge in. Many also advocate, in Gregory Pappus's words, a radically empirical shift toward, quote, a more non-ideal, contextualist, problem-centered, and inquiry-oriented approach. What should be the starting point of political inquiry? If we reply with some kind of empiricism, then what does it mean to take our encultured experience seriously? Far from subjectivizing social and political inquiry, it implies, Pappus concludes, that, quote, there are as many problems of injustice as there are problematic situations suffered in a particular way. End quote. Start and end with the actual and specifiable, Dewey says. The distress, the disaffection, the struggle, the bleeding. It all starts by constructing a theory to discern the principles that would be rationally agreed to in a perfectly fair society, then uses this purified ideal to construct a moral compass for dealing with non-ideal conditions that are closer to home. That is, he starts with a reflective product as if it were primary. Dewey starts with the predicament where it pinches, regardless of our ideas about it, then idealizes to direct life in a way that deals with it. Pappas takes Dewey as his model for an empirical point of origin, and he argues that Dewey's approach was more radically contextual and problem-centered than many 21st century non-ideal theorists. Dewey famously wrote in The Public and Its Problems, quote, "The man who wears the shoe knows best that it pinches and where it pinches, even if the expert shoemaker is the best judge of how the trouble is to be remedied." The shoemaker must begin with the problematic pinch and end with a demonstration that resolves it. This is a demonstration from first-hand experience, not logic. The emphasis isn't on abstract inference, it's on plunging in, exhibiting the problem as it's experienced, imaginatively rehearsing ways to deal with it, and showing that the situation has been met. Analogously, political inquiry is to accord with the denotative method. It must begin and end with problems as experienced. Like the person wearing the shoe, political stakeholders, and perhaps their proxies, are in a better position than attached experts to speak for themselves about how the difficulty pinches. Respect for experience, Dewey urged, carries with it, quote, a respect for others, the centers of experience, end quote. For so often, experience is fragmented, underdeveloped, and incomplete. This is not to say that we should take all public statements at face value. Those suffering troubles legitimately demand inquiry and a more than begrudging response, and they are essential contributors to social knowledge. But situations don't come prepackaged with any party's preferred explanations. They're specific diagnoses of the problem or their prescription. Nevertheless, when experts and stakeholders appeal to each other and cooperate, political problem solving can be creative, critical, and self-corrective by raising questions, imagining alternatives, and putting ideas to the test. By going first and last to problems as experienced and refusing to settle on a way forward that hasn't proven itself through that trial by fire. Democratic communication about shared problems improves the odds that we might find paths that respect legitimate interests, evaluations, and identities of individuals, institutions, and groups. At the same time, participation can reduce apathy, build community, and create consummatory value for what had been a babble of meanings. All right, next, Dewey's ethical theory. Well, that's what that book is about. Condensed version here of the last chapter. The gist of Dewey's mature ethical theory is that no single moral concept will reliably put everything on your radar that needs to be there. Hence, no factor of moral life is the overriding source of normative justification. Dewey fully articulated his wide telescoping ethical theory in a 1930 presentation at the French Philosophical Society in Paris, eventually back translated as Three Independent Factors in Morals. This essay was a blueprint for Dewey and Tuff's 1932 Ethics, to point to Steve Levine's edited volume on that. It's very good. He hypothesized that each of the three major Western ethical systems represents a distinctive, non-subjective, experiential root of moral life. The Greeks zoomed in on desire or aspiration as the primary experiential root. Kantian deontologists privileged obligation. Virtue-oriented British moralists like Hume and Smith fronted social approval. Dewey hypothesized that each basic experiential root is expressed in that system's leading fundamental concept. Conception of the good are rooted in aspirations. Conception of duty, law, and right are rooted in obligatory compliance. And conceptions of virtue are rooted in social approbation and disapprobation. Each ethical system seeks to bring these divergent roots within, wholly within, the unidimensional logical scope of its own category, which they hypostatize and universalize as the supreme one from which other categories are derived. Each strives for a one-size-fits-all organization of moral cognition under a single covering concept, and thereby subordinates experiential factors not blanketed by that concept. If we dissolve this one or none mentality and begin and end with pre-theoretical moral experience as it comes, however, we find that desires, obligations, and approbations often get tangled up with each other. They get in each other's way. And they flow from sufficiently independent springs that they are best perceived and analyzed through multiple concepts, none of which has overriding moral force. If Dewey is right, then focusing in advance on getting the theory right, as though all else follows, that's called ethics. Getting the theory right, as though all else follows, will fail to denote, to show frictions basic to moral situations. Traditional theorizing's zeal for a unitary view, in his words, oversimplifies and standardizes moral life. Even as the multidimensional complexity of actual situations as humanly lived requires us to cooperatively, quote, attend more fully to the concrete elements entering into the situations in which we must act. If moral problems require us to conscientiously reconcile and coordinate heterogeneous elements that cannot be reduced to a coverall property, then we must find a practical footing to manage incommensurate factors which pull us in different ways. And we must evaluate the normative claims these conflicting factors make on us. To see and answer all moral questions through the lens of only one factor, say, as a bottom of matter of rights or duties, not downstream consequences of duty, not character. But what is good, not what's right, but what I should do, and not who I should become. Risks lopsided, partial, and exclusionary deliberation. Okay. Last section is the end means continuum. Dewey was no fan of pat maxims, but had he ever formulated one to clarify exactly what he thought made deliberations more intelligent in a way that compensates for our overbearing will to impose half-baked schemes on situations? It might spotlight his signature emphasis on the ends means continuum. Always state your ends in terms of the means you plan to use to achieve them. Dewey analyzed the feedback loop that implicitly connects what people mean to do into view in his terms, how they're going about it means, and what they've actually done is. These are inseparable despite the familiar gulf between intentions and consequences. That's when the U.S. Soil Conservation Service vigorously incentivized kudzu in order to control erosion after the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. Worked. As long as you're just obsessively fixated on the one thing, right? You're concerned about the rest. You don't follow it into nothing. Dewey influenced research on what Columbia University sociologist Robert K. Merton called the unanticipated consequences of purposive social action in a 1936 Watershed article that, yes, directly cites Dewey, right where he's proposing to cite. Later social scientists contracted this famously to the law of unintended consequences. In the idiom of Sherlock Holmes, Theoretical idealizations can keep us concentrating on what is vital instead of being dissipated by what is incidental. But we must not purchase clarity at the cost of incorrigibility, oversimplification, and willful ignorance. If we follow Dewey's denotative method, we'll speak of the things we're consciously aiming for in terms of proposed actions and programs, and we'll dramatically rehearse and check the actual spatio-temporal consequences of actions. These are never, in Dewey's words, subject to determination in terms of abstract theory. That is, laudable ideals and general desirability of an idea in the abstract can't antecedently determine how interventions will play out on the ground, how the road will meet the road. So we need a reliable, open-ended method for conscientiously bringing our thinking back to la vida. Dewey was a devastating critic of the notion in deontological ethics, echoed by Rawls, that some objectives are ends in themselves. The notion of a self-justifying end, good, wholly independent of context and consequences, is dangerously short-sighted about the ways events relate to one another over time and scale. When we direct an ideal such as justice, liberty, or the like, into the overarching end, we put, in Dewey's words, a pseudo-stamp of moral justification upon success at any price. We load the evaluative dice by noting and exhibiting only that which suits our grand design, while ignoring extraneous results unrelated to our preoccupations, just science. Take security as an end. Robert Bergman's book, Rise and weighted a nicely controversial term for you. Rising Kill First argues that Israel's long-standing practice of targeted assassination, drone strikes, bombings, shootings, and poisonings has resulted in many tactical successes that have dramatically worsened diplomatic relations. Yet, in Bergman's view, the collective aspirations for effective security among conflicting actors in the Middle East can only be achieved through diplomacy, not imposed through the method of force. Bergman relates the tactics of Israel's Mossad security forces in an interview, quote, "They felt that at the tip of their fingers they could hit someone way behind enemy lines, deep in the enemy state, and solve the problem. And therefore they do not need to turn to statesmanship or political reconciliation. And therefore I think the story of the use of these special means is a series of extraordinary tactical successes, but at the same time, a disastrous political failure." End quote. When groups track only the isolated ends that they consciously intended to bring about, security, eliminating an enemy, retributive justice, they don't usually feel responsible for collateral, often forecastable side effects of their chosen means. More generally, in the convective storm of terror and retribution, reactive habits prevail over experimental ones. So clashing sides double down on failed policies and tactics that inflict misery across generations. Choices by Israel's Mossad or by Hamas illustrate the hard truth that Dewey drove home when making decisions about actions, public policies, or institutional structures. The only defensible alternative to singling out and favoring some fragmentary, abstractly desirable result as the end is to evaluate desires, intentions, and consequences as themselves, quote, means of further consequences. Choices are pregnant with unanticipated connections, both proximal and distant, to explore practical implications of a commonplace from ecology and other natural sciences. Quote, "Nothing happens which is final in the sense that it is not part of an ongoing stream of events." End quote. We always do more than we mean to do. Whatever ends our interventions bring about will engender many existential connections and possibilities. So these must be empirically noted and impartially evaluated as potential helps or hindrances in our creative meaning-making struggles. Conclusion. During its first century, experience in nature garnered a reputation for equal parts lucidity and opacity. It deserves much wider recognition for being one of the greatest 20th century American intellectual resources for respecting each other as experiential centers, while extending perception progressively further and deeper into the interpersonal, sociocultural, and natural relationships in which we're situated. Whatever its limitations, many limitations, the overall effect of the book is to unstop the reader's senses and imagination to a world, in Dewey's words, which is lived, suffered, and enjoyed as well as logically thought of. Experience in nature exemplifies a receptive humility that respects the doings, sufferings, and imaginings of that world as the starting point and, as he says, the last word in all human inquiries. Thank you.
Taking time for questions? Mark, start with you.
Well, we've heard it before, but, so I had a colleague years ago who, as I was going on about the one with John Dewey and moral deliberation in his account, he would say, well, you know, Mark, Dewey's all right for everyday problem solving, but there is no way of, he provides no way of dealing with radical evil. And you might, you know, I think we're faced with radical evil now in various ways around the world. And so what's the story, your story?
Yeah, and at least the bit there on the means and continuum. I'm trying to grapple with evil as I actually see it, and see. And so I think Dewey can diagnose things that we would probably call evil. So I think it's probably false to say that he can't deal with things that are evil. But with regard to the public and its problems, right, and the stuff about democratic communication, you got to have some baseline minimum. Right? I mean, things can be royally dysfunctional, but you can still have a baseline minimum. I'll give an example of that. Brian Norton, a friend, I think many of us know, did this book on trying to talk about it with a lot of examples where people are dysfunctional, they fundamentally disagree with each other, politically divisive, and yet they come together to do something. And in one of his case studies, it's in the Chesapeake Valley, where millions of people now think of themselves as living in a watershed. And about 30 years ago, they all thought of themselves as living somewhere over there. I think there's some kind of body of water, some bay, I don't know, that's delineated by boundaries that had nothing to do with me, right, and my waterland. But now millions of people think differently about it. And that's a transformative matter. But now people are just bickering about a watershed, right? They're still divided, they're still arguing, and Brian rightly celebrates that, right? Bickering about a watershed is progress over bickering about just a bay that you think is disconnected from you in your life. He gives an example of the Platte River that I think is really great. And this is, you know, even redder now than it was 10 years ago when he was writing this in terms of just the politics of the area. But basically, you had the sandhill cranes were declining in population because the water was being used by ranchers and farmers, right? Too much of it was being used, and it wasn't getting to where it needed to go on the Platte River by the time it was in central Nebraska. So the feds came in and said, "Hey, it's an endangered species, right? The Endangered Species Act says you got to protect the habitat. You're not. You want us to deal with this or you? The liberal, conservative, it doesn't matter. You don't want the Fed to deal with it. Right, so they agreed they would deal with this. And so they had a multi-state committee. You got what, the folks from Wyoming, folks from Nebraska, folks from Colorado. And it took them 10 years of constant bickering, but sitting around tables with different sort of proxies for different groups, and politically divisive. They came up with a plan. And it's working. Today, there's a significant recovery of that. So baseline, the answer to that was you had to have some kind of baseline for communication, right? And it doesn't, that there's tremendous divisiveness and bickering and polarities. Even within that context, there was just two examples. You can actually have significant progress. I think a lot of what we find is within that context. Can we go beyond that context where we find ourselves having to take up arms? Yeah. If Hitler rises again, right? Even philosophers may be willing to do something, right? If things break down that badly, right? So completely, right? And if you want to call back, and if only that counts as radical evil, what does Dewey have to say about that? Nothing. So that's what he means. Yeah, he's right.
Alex?
And the nature of our instrumental relationship with nature is going to, whether you tell a story about that in the book or whether you're thinking about it, because so the Wendell Berry came up in an excursion yesterday, and one of the things he said that we are in the nature of our relationship with nature is instrumental, that we can't avoid that because we're consuming.
They're resources, yeah.
To go after the dwelling in the oils and the home in our ecology ecosystem. For Wendell Berry, he draws a distinction between, I can't remember how he puts it, but the economy of love, economy of kind of unthinking and care and consumption. I can't remember. I mean, you could call it capitalist consumption, whatever you want to call it, but when you're treating something, as a means.
Sure.
Not as an end. So what struck me about the care is not, there's a care about, the inheriting of the care, the craftsmanship. And so I was wondering what, I mean, it's a lot of kind of just suggest that, I just gave a paper song with my close friend.
You did laser focus.
Consumption, as being sort of like part of the story.
Anyway.
And then how that makes sort of the means to end.
Sure. Yeah. So yes, I do. I am dealing with that in the book that I get to start working on when I finally get a sabbatical. So that's the plan. Though I've written a fair bit to try to engage the standard sort of environmental ethics debates about intrinsic value and instrumental value. And my general view is that we can sidestep that. Because I think it's even safe to say maybe the majority of environmental ethicists think that we have to go through a big paradigm shift, right, toward valuing nature for itself, and get away from any kind of more instrumental means and relationship with nature. Now, as for myself, in terms of my personal, what philosophy captures my imagination, I'm probably more of an ecocentrist of that sort, in fact. Right? I do have some strong tendencies in that direction. When I read Aldo Leopold, my eyes water, and so I probably have some tendencies in that direction, but that's not actually a philosophical position. Right? My view is that people are making a little too much out of that idea that you've got to have this dramatic paradigm shift away from, right, the sort of standard anthropocentric means and deliberation toward disrespecting nature for itself, right, independent of any means, right? And I guess my view is that what we need and what we must have to meet the situations that we find in terms of our what we can just call our ecological crisis is ecological imagination. That is, it is something that we can cultivate. I was chair of an environmental studies program at a little college close 6 years ago. And every student in that program got really good at something. And it seemed to be something like they could look out of the corner of their eye and see their connections, their relationships that constitute whatever they're focusing on, right? So I'm having a cup of coffee, one of my favorite examples, right? And I'm enjoying, maybe the songbirds in my backyard in the summer, which are dwindling because they're plenty coffee in the wintering nesting habitats of the birds that I'm watching right now. And so there's a connection, right? That kind of thing, most people don't know anything about, right? Or when they're eating the cheese, they don't think about the dairy cows that are eating the corn that comes from the breadbasket of the United States and is shipped over there. And we're dumping fertilizer on them, and the fertilizer goes into the watershed and down the Gulf of Mexico, right, creating a dead zone the size of New Jersey every summer, killing tens of millions of fish, right? That it's all connected. Or they're thinking of the Google Cloud, right? In the Google Cloud, there's apparently this wispy kind of thing that no one touches the Earth, instead of the fact that it's right, multiple many square mile facilities sucking more energy and water than ever in the history of our country, right? That doesn't make any of those things bad. It's not, no, dairy's bad or Google's bad or something like that. It raises questions about these connections. My point was, my students got really good at that kind of thing. And it was just like intuitive for me, right? None of them, as far as I know, had to be convinced to have some kind of grand paradigm shift to a totally different, radically non-anthropocentric theory of value. That's an idea that philosophers get carried away with, right? It's exactly what Dewey said. We don't need to get caught up in the abstraction. We can do the work of meeting the problems without it. So I'm suggesting a sidestep, right? Cultivate this kind of ecological imagination, and it's not abstract. I've seen it done, right? We can all do it. We can all be part of that, and we can have these fundamental value debates. I think they are important. I'm not dismissing them. I'm just saying they're secondary, right? And many ethicists have placed them as primary. Nothing to understand. Please, but is that I didn't see that. I'm going to defer to you.
First.
Okay, so thank you very much indeed for your inspiring speech, and thank you above all to my side for making it explicit the consequences of Dewey's kind of philosophical approach toward the current situation. I have more of a comment rather than a kind of clear question. And the comment is connected to Mark Johnson quoting referring to the very idea of radical evil. And in my view, but I believe you share it, but let me know. The very strategy to transform an evil, a human evil, into a radical evil is belongs to the same strategy of making ends separate from the means through which we achieve them. That is, of course, in front of what is happening in Gaza, every one of us is deeply impacted emotively, affectively, and impacted. But we should not forget that this is not radical evil per se, but it is the ultimate result of a series of human, social, political actions and reactions that have brought to this kind of result. And so radical evil, from a certain point of view, is not a good conceptual tool from a Deweyan point of view to me. What do you think about that?
So the very question, right, framing it in terms of radical evil is not a useful instrument for it, right? It's a framework that's going to hide most of what's actually going on, right? Most of the problems are going to escape our notice because we're fixated on something that fits some concept. Radical evil must be something, it's an abstract concept. We've got focused on it, right? It must be terrifically important. I'm going to frame my entire philosophy around it as a response to radical evil. And now we're only going to see the things that fit, right? And everything else will escape notice. But most of the problems of human existence, therefore, will escape notice. Yeah, if I'm understanding, I answered in the response by hopefully by just framing the question. I agree with you. That's not going to be terribly helpful. But I'm not denying that there's something to the concept. Right, I think we have faced circumstances that are so horrific, right? Just so unthinkable horrific. Right. You a name for that, radical evil? That's fine. Do we have a lot to say about that? I don't. I probably wouldn't find myself reading a lot of Dewey, just to try to think about that. But there are a lot of other great authors for dealing with. But I do think about Dewey for dealing with most of the problems of humanity. So maybe possibly they're the most extreme versions. I'd be interested to hear what others think about that as well. Danny.
Thank you for the talk. I too was also impressed on the use of example of security in Israel, but with the mention of security that was justification for the targeted strikes. Reminded me of arguments in 2012 that led to a concern in U.S. cybersecurity discussions of the 2012 shooter in California and the cops being unable to access his iPhone without basically breaking and forcing cyber companies to do something with IP. And I feel like there's a connection here concerning memory and absolutism. And what would be like a relationship with memory here to think that you or you would say in your response to moving against this kind of fundamentalism, absolutism?
Yeah, well, I'd like to question, what would you take that in terms of the role of memory? And like say a little bit more, because
The reason I was thinking about cybersecurity is because I felt like I would imagine the reasons that Israel was justifying their use of force was not all that different from the arguments the police were making to have full backdoor access to the cell phones. And the concern in the cybersecurity world with Android was that if the police get backdoor access, they can now have they can just spy on us and not have to go through the courts to get a warrant.
Yeah. I mean, but much of the discussion, I even remember thinking about Dewey in that case, like back in when that was, like 13 years ago. And you obviously, at least you have competing sort of, root, experiential roots. Right? One of them is based on social welfare. So some kind of welfareist model the police could use, right? That you need to be able to access this because shit happens. It's awful, and we need to have access. But then you've got various sorts of claims of rights, privacy rights, right? And then you've got liberty being championed as an end by, say, libertarian or civil libertarian. And these are in conflict with each other. And the general philosophical approach is to figure out which of those is going to carry the day, right? Which of those is going to carry the moral weight. And we debate in our conferences about which one it is that we're going to give priority or at least give ranking to. And I think Dewey's view is that there's not a way antecedent to the situation to do that, we have to deal with that democratically and through communication. And I do think he's right about that. And so I remember the case, and I remember thinking that people's analyses of the case was always lopsided. It seemed to me to be insufficiently entangled in a fairly complicated situation, but pretty rich one.
Yeah, I think part of the reason for that was because I was in middle school and remember it being like a conversation in my social studies class, and people treating it, even with my fellow peers in middle school, as an exclusive either or.
Yeah,
Right.
that's great. I appreciate that reference to that being a middle schoolish outlook. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's an immature outlook to think in either or in that way. And if we would kindly grow out of it and grow up, that would be a very welcome thing indeed.
All right, I think we have time for another full question. So let's please thank. So we've had a great few days of very different interpretations of experience in nature, very different evaluations of experience in nature. But it really brings me a lot of pleasure to see all the diverse engagements with Dewey's work that has been presented at this conference. I wish I could have seen every talk, but I only have myself to blame for that.
Yeah, I think I speak for everyone, I hope I do, that we want to thank you. We want to thank you and all, and the faculty and students who gave their time and effort to make this come together.
Yeah, absolutely. I especially
Lovely.
I couldn't have done it without Rebecca Dekas from Conference Services, as well as my graduate assistants, Sunny Neenan, Harrison Jackson, and Ken Wilson, other student volunteers, especially Jeff Slister and Stephen Houchins, and all the other students, faculty, and staff who have helped. Yeah, who's hungry?
There are these books down here. They're totally free. Anyone who'd like to grab one, there's, I think, 20